I felt eyes on me I couldn't place, until I knew whose they were. It was an odd sensation, like someone was watching me, but every time I glanced around, no one was there. Maybe it's just my imagination, I thought, turning back to my work. My name's Emma, and I'm an executive assistant at a busy marketing firm. I'm 25, fresh out of college, and this is my first real job. The office is a sleek, open-plan space with glass walls and modern furniture. The steady hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of fresh coffee from the break room are my constant companions during the day. My boss, Mr. Harrison, is the head of marketing. He's tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a smile that could light up a room. He's also married, with 2 kids, which makes my attraction to him completely off limits. I try not to dwell on it, but it's hard when he's always around, praising my work or cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Tonight, we were working late on a big presentation. The rest of the office had cleared out, leaving just the 2 of us in the conference room. The air felt thick with tension, or maybe that was just me. "Emma, can you check these figures for me?" Mr. Harrison asked, handing me a stack of papers. "Sure."
"Mr. Harrison," I said, taking them and trying not to notice how his fingers brushed mine. As we worked, that feeling of being watched crept back in.
I glanced at the door, but it was shut. Maybe it was just the security guard on his rounds. "You okay, Emma?" Mr. Harrison asked, catching my distraction. "Yeah, just tired, I guess," I replied, forcing a smile. He nodded and went back to his notes. I finished checking the figures and handed the papers back. "Thanks, Emma. You're a lifesaver," he said, flashing that smile again. My heart skipped, and I felt my cheeks heat up. "Anytime, Mr. Harrison." As we wrapped up, I heard a noise outside the room. Footsteps, maybe. I looked, but the hallway was empty. "Think we're the last ones here?" Mr. Harrison said, noticing my unease. "Yeah, probably just security," I said, trying to convince myself. But the feeling wouldn't shake. As we packed up to leave, I scanned the room one last time. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving in the dark hallway. "Mr. Harrison, I think someone's out there," I whispered. He frowned, walked to the door, and peeked out. "No one's there, Emma. Maybe it's just your imagination." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as we left the office and headed to the parking lot, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was still watching us. When I got home that night, the feeling stuck with me. Who could it be? And why? I decided I had to tell someone about this. Maybe putting it out there would help me figure it out. If you're hooked and want to know what happens next, sign up for more. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I kept replaying the shadow in the hallway, wondering if I'd imagined it. But something told me I hadn't. At work, I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting. Mr. Harrison was in meetings all day, so I had time to think. Maybe it was just a coworker working late, I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. During lunch, I decided to confide in my friend Zoe, who worked in HR. We met in the break room, and I told her about the shadow and the feeling of being watched. Zoe's eyes widened. "That's creepy, Emma. Have you told security?" I shook my head. "I don't have any proof, it's just a feeling." "Well, maybe you should keep an eye out," she said, sipping her coffee. "And be careful around Mr. Harrison. You know how office gossip can be." I nodded, but I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Zoe didn't know about my feelings for him, and I wasn't about to tell her. Later that afternoon, Mr. Harrison called me into his office. "Emma, I need you to help me with something tonight. We're behind on the presentation and I could use your expertise." My heart raced. "Another late night with him?" "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I'll be there." As the day ended, the office emptied out again. I stayed behind, waiting for Mr. Harrison to finish his calls. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. When he finally emerged from his office, he looked stressed. "Ready to get started?" he asked. I nodded, and we headed to the conference room. As we worked, the tension between us was palpable. I could feel his gaze on me, and every time our hands brushed, it sent a jolt through me. "Emma, you're doing great work," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I blushed. "Thanks, Mr. Harrison. I'm just doing my job." He smiled, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But then, a noise from the hallway broke the spell. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his expression serious. "Stay here. I'll check it out." He left the room, and I waited, my heart pounding. Minutes felt like hours. When he finally returned, he looked shaken. "What was it?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. But I could tell he was lying. "Mr. Harrison, if something's wrong, I need to know." He sighed. "I think someone was listening at the door. But when I went out, they were gone." A chill ran down my spine. Who could it be? "I don't know, Emma, but we need to be careful." As we finished up, the tension was thicker than ever. I couldn't tell if it was from the mysterious watcher or from the unspoken feelings between us. When we left the office, Mr. Harrison walked me to my car. "Emma, I don't want you to worry. I'll make sure you're safe." I nodded, but as I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder what he meant. Safe from what? Or from whom? That night I couldn't sleep. The shadow, the noise, Mr. Harrison's words, they all swirled in my mind. And then, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing." My blood ran cold. Who was this? And what did they think they knew? I had to find out. But I didn't know where to start. Maybe Zoe could help, or perhaps I should tell Mr. Harrison. But something told me this was just the beginning. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to face it head on, no matter the cost. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach, the mysterious text from the previous night, still burning in my mind. "I know what you're doing." It had come from an unknown number, and no matter how many times I reread it, I couldn't make sense of it. What was I doing? Staying late at the office with Mr. Harrison? Wrestling with feelings I shouldn't have? Or was it something more? The uncertainty gnawed at me as I stared at my phone, willing it to reveal its secrets. I tried to convince myself it was a prank or a wrong number, but deep down, I knew better. The eerie feeling of being watched, the shadow I'd glimpsed in, the hallway, the faint noise outside the conference room last night, it all pointed to something darker. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was closing in. At the office, I did my best to act normal, but every glance from a coworker felt loaded, like they knew something I didn't. During our morning coffee break, Zoe, my closest friend at work, picked up on my unease. "You okay, Emma? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, my hands trembling slightly around my mug. "Just didn't sleep well, too much on my mind." She nodded, her brow furrowing. "If you need to talk, I'm here." "Thanks, Zoe." I meant it, but I wasn't ready to spill everything, not until I understood what was happening. The day crawled by, and I found myself avoiding Mr. Harrison's office. I didn't know if he was tied to the text, and until I had answers, I wanted distance. But that plan crumbled when he called me in for a meeting. "Emma, I need your help with the final touches on the presentation," he said, his tone strictly professional, though his gaze lingered on me a moment too long. "Of course, Mr. Harrison," I replied, trying to ignore the familiar flutter in my chest as I followed him into his office. We worked in silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. I could feel his eyes on me, and every time I glanced up, he'd look away, pretending to focus on the papers in front of him. It was driving me crazy. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mr. Harrison, about last night, do you think someone is really watching us?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know, Emma, but I promise I'll keep you safe." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened my unease. Safe from what? And why did he feel responsible for me? Before I could press him, we finished up, and I gathered my things to leave. That's when my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. 8 p.m. Come alone." My heart raced. This was my chance to uncover the truth. But it could also be a trap. I stole a glance at Mr. Harrison, who was busy packing his briefcase. Should I tell him? In the end, I decided against it. If he was involved, I couldn't risk tipping him off. I needed to face this alone. That evening, I drove to the warehouse, my nerves fraying with every mile. The building loomed ahead, abandoned and eerie, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls straight out of a nightmare. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots as I pulled my jacket tighter against the cold. Approaching the entrance, I spotted a figure in the shadows. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure stepped into the faint light, revealing a familiar face. Liam, a quiet coworker from the IT department. I'd barely noticed him before. He always kept to himself. "Liam, what are you doing here?" I asked, confusion swirling in my mind. He smirked, his eyes glinting with something unsettling. "I'm the one who's been watching you, Emma, and I know everything." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" "I know about you and Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice low and accusing. "The late nights, the stolen glances. It's obvious what's going on." I shook my head, heat rising to my cheeks. "There's nothing going on. We're just working." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the way you look at him, and the way he looks at you." Anger flared inside me. "So what? Why do you care?" His expression darkened as he stepped closer. "Because I care about you, Emma. I've liked you since you started here, but you never noticed me. You were too busy with him." I stared at him, stunned. Liam liked me? I'd had no clue. "Liam, I'm sorry, but I don't feel the same way." "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can't let this continue. If you don't stop seeing him, I'll tell everyone. I'll ruin both of you." My heart pounded. This was spiraling out of control. "Liam, please don't do this. There's nothing to tell. We're not involved." But he wasn't listening. "You have until tomorrow to decide. End it with him, or the whole office will know." With that, he turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone in the cavernous space, my mind reeling. Driving home, I couldn't stop shaking. I had to warn Mr. Harrison about Liam's threat. But what if Liam was right? What if there was something between us that I'd been refusing to admit? The lines were blurring, and I didn't know what to believe anymore. Just as I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "I'm not the only one watching." My breath caught in my throat. Who else could be involved? And what did they want? Time was slipping away, and I had no idea who I could trust or what would happen next. The next day, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my bones. The texts, the watcher, Liam's threats. It was all too much. I knew I had to tell Mr. Harrison everything, even if it meant risking whatever we had. I found him in his office, poring over some papers. "Mr. Harrison, can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up, concern etching his features. "Of course, Emma. What's wrong?" I took a deep breath and spilled it all. The cryptic texts, Liam's confession, the threats. As I spoke, his expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Emma, I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this," he said, his voice low and grave. "We need to handle this carefully. I think we should confront Liam together." I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me. At least I wasn't facing this alone. We arranged to meet Liam in the conference room after hours. As we waited, the silence between us crackled with tension. Mr. Harrison's presence beside me was steady, reassuring, yet it only heightened my awareness of the line we'd been towing. When Liam stormed in, his face was a storm of anger and desperation. "So, you told him," he spat, his glare piercing me. "Yes, Liam." "This has to stop," I said, fighting to keep my voice even. He laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You think you can just brush me aside? I've been watching you, Emma. I know how you feel about him." Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his tone firm. "Liam, this is unacceptable. You're putting Emma in danger, and I won't stand for it." Liam's eyes blazed. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? But I know the truth. You're not as innocent as you pretend." Before I could respond, the door burst open, and Zoe rushed in, her face pale as a ghost. "Emma, Mr. Harrison, you need to get out of here. Liam's not the only one involved." I stared at her, confusion swirling. "What do you mean?" Zoe hesitated, then blurted, "I've been getting texts too. Someone's been manipulating all of us." Before she could elaborate, a figure stepped from the shadows. Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Harrison's wife. My heart plummeted. "Mrs. Harrison? What are you doing here?" Her smile was icy, cutting. "I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" The truth unraveled like a thread pulled too hard. Mrs. Harrison had suspected her husband of infidelity and hired Liam to spy on us. But Liam's feelings for me twisted the plan, turning it into a tangled mess of jealousy and obsession. "I never meant for it to go this far," Liam muttered, his head bowed in shame. Mrs. Harrison's gaze locked onto me, her eyes brimming with hurt and fury. "I trusted you, Emma. I thought you were a friend." Guilt crashed over me like a tide. "Mrs. Harrison, I swear nothing happened between us. We were just working." She shook her head, tears glistening. "It doesn't matter now. The damage is done." Mr. Harrison moved toward her, his face ashen. "Darling, please, let's talk about this." But she turned away, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. In that moment, the weight of my choices hit me. My attraction to Mr. Harrison had clouded my judgment, and now it was tearing lives apart. "I think it's best if I leave," I said, softly. "I'll find another job. I'm sorry for everything." Mr. Harrison's eyes met mine, heavy with regret. "Emma, you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I replied resolute. "For everyone's sake." Walking out of the office, I felt a bittersweet mix of sadness and relief. It was time to start over, to untangle myself from forbidden love and dangerous secrets. Weeks later, I settled into a new job at a different company. It wasn't as glamorous, but it offered a clean slate. Sitting at my new desk, I reflected on the chaos I'd left behind. I'd learned a hard lesson about the perils of forbidden attraction and the value of honesty and integrity. Mr. Harrison lingered in my thoughts now and then, but I knew our paths were never meant to intertwine that way. As for the Watcher, perhaps the real mystery was one I'd woven myself, chasing shadows instead of substance. But now, I was free to pour my energy into my career, to nurture real relationships, to be true to who I was, and maybe, just maybe, I'd find love one day, somewhere it wasn't forbidden.